The air at the main gate of forward operating base Kestrel was a physical weight. It was thick with the shimmering heat of the Afghan sun, the taste of airborne dust, and the low, grinding thrum of diesel generators that was the base's ceaseless heartbeat. It was an atmosphere of bored tension, a place where the mundane and the lethal were separated by nothing more than a strip of concertina wire and the snap judgment of a sentry. This gate was its own small kingdom, and today, as on most days, its self-appointed king was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne. He stood with his feet planted wide on the scorched gravel, a human bulwark carved from granite and indignation. His barrel chest strained the fabric of his desert camouflage utilities, and the thick muscles of his neck and forearms were mapped with veins that pulsed with the slow, arrogant rhythm of his own self-importance. Thorne was holding court. A semicircle of young Marines, their faces still soft with the memory of civilian life, formed his audience. They were the chorus to his one-man play, their eager nods and forced chuckles the currency he demanded for his lessons on what it meant to be a man, a Marine, a predator in a world of prey. His voice was a tool of blunt force, a percussive instrument that hammered his pronouncements into the thick air. It was not a voice for conversation, but for declaration, a sound designed to crush dissent before it could form. He gestured with a thumb toward the distant hazy mountains. "Out there," he boomed, his words a rockslide of gravel and certainty. "There are only two types of people, us and targets. You forget that, you end up in a bag. You hesitate, you get your buddies put in bags. Strength is the only thing that matters, not what you think, not what you feel, what you can do, what you can break, what you can impose upon the world." He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle on the young shoulders before him. He scanned their faces, pleased with the mixture of fear and admiration he saw there. This was his purpose, his art form, molding these soft boys into hard weapons, and the primary tool for that forging was the sheer, undeniable force of his own presence. His worldview was a brutally simple edifice, constructed on a foundation of physical dominance. He saw the world as a hierarchy, a ladder of strength. He was near the top, and his duty was to kick down at those below him to remind them of their place. Respect was a one-way street, flowing upward to him from the weak and the subordinate. Disrespect was any failure to acknowledge this fundamental law of nature, and it had to be stamped out with theatrical prejudice. To him, silence in his presence was insubordination, stillness was weakness, thought was hesitation. His gaze swept the area, a predator scanning his territory for any sign of disorder, any nail that wasn't hammered down. He saw the shimmering heat haze rising from the hoods of idling Humvees, the disciplined snap of a salute from a passing lieutenant, the glint of the sun off the rifle barrels of the guards in the watchtower. Everything was in its place, orbiting the gravitational center of his authority. His ego was a carefully constructed fortress, its walls built from the deference of others. He needed their fear to feel his own strength. He needed their attention to validate his existence. It was a brittle kind of power, though he would never have recognized it as such. He saw it as the natural order of things, as solid and immutable as the mountains themselves. The world worked because men like him made it work, with loud voices, hard fists, and an uncomplicated certainty that left no room for doubt. It was then that his sweeping proprietary gaze snagged on an anomaly. Near the blast-proof pedestrian gate, a small island of profound stillness existed in the restless sea of military energy. A figure stood there, waiting for the electronic lock to cycle. The person was small-framed, lost inside a faded gray hoodie, the hood pulled up despite the suffocating heat. The worn fabric, the simple cargo pants, the scuffed non-regulation boots. It was the uniform of someone who did not belong, a civilian, a contractor, someone from the world outside the wire. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The base had a strict dress code, even for civilian support staff, a code he delighted in enforcing with maximum condescension. This was a violation. This was a disruption to his perfect, ordered kingdom. The figure was a woman. He could tell from the slight curve of her hip and the slender line of her neck visible beneath the hood. She stood with her back mostly to him, utterly absorbed in the meticulous task of cleaning a pair of thick, black-framed glasses with a small microfiber cloth. Her movements were a study in economy, precise and unhurried. There was no fidgeting, no shifting of weight, no nervous glance toward the armed guards or the imposing gate. She was simply there, a pocket of calm in the swirling dust and tension, as disconnected from her surroundings as a rock in a rushing stream. She did not seem to hear his booming voice or feel the oppressive weight of his presence. She was just cleaning her glasses. To Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, this was not calm. It was an insult. Her stillness was not peace. It was a flagrant act of disrespect. In his world, you acknowledged the apex predator. You made yourself small. You showed deference. Her complete lack of reaction to the force of nature that was Marcus Thorne was an intolerable challenge to his authority. He felt a familiar hot prickle of indignation rise in his chest. His internal monologue, a constant stream of self-aggrandizement and judgment, focused on her like a targeting laser. Look at this one. Lost, little bird? Thinks the rules don't apply to her? A little techie or a pencil pusher from some alphabet agency thinks she's too important to even look up. He saw her unassuming posture not as quiet confidence, but as timid weakness. He saw her focus not as professionalism, but as insolent disregard. He had found his next lesson, his next example for the young Marines who watched his every move. He decided to make a show of it. With a smirk to his audience, a silent promise of the entertainment to come. He began his approach. His boots crunched on the gravel with deliberate, menacing weight. Each step was a statement. I am coming. I am here. You will acknowledge me. He moved like a shark closing in, confident in the panic his presence would inevitably create. The chorus of young Marines trailed behind him, a pack of hyenas following their lion, eager to witness the kill. One of them, a corporal named Henderson, who served as Thorne's most dedicated sycophant, snickered audibly, a high, wheezing sound that set Thorne's teeth on edge, but served its purpose. The stage was set. The audience was in place. The target was acquired. The woman did not move. She continued to polish her glasses, her head bowed slightly, her focus absolute. The slow, circular motion of her thumb on the lens was mesmerizing in its steadiness. She seemed to exist in a different dimension of time, where the oppressive heat and the grinding tension of the gate could not reach her. Thorne came to a stop directly beside her, casting a large shadow that engulfed her small frame. He waited, allowing the silence to stretch, a calculated theatrical pause designed to build pressure. He expected her to startle, to look up with wide, frightened eyes, to stammer an apology. That was how the script always went. She did not. She finished polishing one lens, folded the cloth with a crisp, precise motion, and began on the other. The utter lack of acknowledgement was more infuriating than any spoken defiance. It was a silent negation of his entire existence. The fortress of his ego detected a crack in its walls. He had to reassert his dominance, quickly and loudly. He cleared his throat, a sound like rocks tumbling in a metal drum. "Lost, little bird," he began, his voice dripping with a thick, patronizing sweetness that was far more menacing than a shout. The Marines behind him shuffled their feet, some of them grinning in anticipation. The woman stopped her polishing. Slowly, without any hint of fear or surprise, she lifted her head. The hood fell back, revealing a face that was neither young nor old, a canvas of sharp angles and pale skin. A thin, silvery scar cut from her left temple down to her jawline, a delicate, almost beautiful flaw. But it was her eyes that arrested him. They were the color of slate, flat and depthless, and they held an unnerving, absolute calm. They were not the eyes of prey. They met his gaze directly, without flinching, without emotion, without any recognition of the threat he represented. They simply registered his presence, cataloged it, and waited. The directness of her gaze threw him off for a fraction of a second. He recovered, doubling down on his condescension to cover his momentary lapse. "I said, are you lost?" he repeated, his voice louder now, harsher. "This is a military checkpoint, sweetheart, not a coffee shop. There are rules here, dress codes. You seem to have missed that memo." He gestured dismissively at her hoodie. "Or maybe you think you're special." She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then she spoke, and her voice was the complete antithesis of his. It was quiet, low, and utterly flat, devoid of any inflection. It was a voice that simply conveyed data. "The system was throwing an error," she said, her gaze shifting from his face to the electronic keypad on the pedestrian gate. "A latency fault in the biometric scanner. I was waiting for the diagnostic to complete." Her technical, impersonal response only fueled his rage. She was refusing to play the game, refusing to engage with his performance of dominance. She was treating him like a piece of the environment, an obstacle to be explained away with jargon. He felt the blood rush to his face. The brittle shell of his ego began to fracture under the pressure of her implacable calm. "I don't care about your computer problems," he snarled, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "I care about discipline. I care about respect. And you are showing none. Who the hell are you and who do you work for?" She slid her freshly cleaned glasses on. The dark lenses hid her slate-gray eyes, but the unnerving calm remained, radiating from her like a field of cold energy. "That's classified," she stated, not as a challenge, but as a simple, immutable fact. That was it. That was the final straw. The word classified, delivered in that flat, emotionless monotone, was the ultimate act of defiance. It was a dismissal of his authority, a claim to a higher, unseen power that he could not acknowledge. Laughter, sharp and ugly, burst from his lips. His sycophant, Corporal Henderson, dutifully echoed the sound. "Classified?" Thorne roared, projecting for his audience. "You hear that, boys? Little Miss Classified here thinks she's a spy. You think that hoodie gives you secret squirrel powers?" He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Let me tell you something. On this gate, my word is law. My authority is the only thing that matters. I am the one who decides who is and who is not classified." To punctuate his declaration, to finally force a reaction from this infuriatingly calm woman, he made his critical error. He reached out and grabbed her arm just above the elbow. His grip was like a vice, his fingers digging into the soft fabric of the hoodie and the firm muscle beneath. It was a gesture of ownership, of absolute physical control. It was the final move in his well-rehearsed play of intimidation. He would hold her there, helpless, until she finally broke, until she gave him the fear and submission he craved. He leaned in, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "Now," he growled, "you're going to answer my question. Who are you?" The world seemed to slow down. For the briefest instant, Thorne felt a strange shift in the woman's arm beneath his grip. It was not a tensing of muscle in resistance, but a subtle, almost fluid realignment of kinetic potential. It was a feeling his body understood on a primal level before his brain could process it, a feeling akin to touching a live power line just before the current arcs. He saw her head tilt, a fractional bird-like movement. He heard a soft, almost inaudible sigh escape her lips, a sound not of fear but of profound weariness, as if dealing with him was a tedious chore she had hoped to avoid. Then she moved. It was not a violent motion. It was not a struggle. It was an act of such impossible speed and biomechanical perfection that it defied comprehension. Her body flowed around the fixed point of his grip. Her left foot slid back a mere inch, grounding her. Her hips rotated with the frictionless grace of a spinning gyroscope. Her free hand, the one that had been hanging loosely at her side, came up not in a fist, but with an open palm. It did not strike his wrist. It simply met it. Simultaneously, pressure radiated from her elbow, the one he was still holding, up his arm, targeting the precise nerve cluster in his shoulder with surgical accuracy. It was a flawless application of physics, a redirection of his own aggressive energy back upon itself. Crack. The sound was not loud, but it was sickeningly clear in the sudden shocked silence. It was the sound of his wrist joint being hyperextended to its absolute limit. A bolt of pure white-hot agony shot up his arm, erasing all thought from his mind. His fingers, which had been clamped like steel talons, spasmed open involuntarily. His entire 230-pound frame, unbalanced and neurologically short-circuited, followed the path of least resistance. He did not fly across the gravel. He did not get thrown. He simply folded. He collapsed downward as if his bones had turned to liquid, his knees buckling in a sequence dictated by her control. Ping. That was the soft sound of the pedestrian gate lock disengaging. The diagnostic was complete. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne landed on the hard-packed earth with a heavy, undignified thud. He was on his back, the wind knocked out of him, his vision filled with the merciless blue of the sky and the dancing black spots of synaptic failure. His arm throbbed with a pain so immense it felt abstract, a concept rather than a sensation. The entire event, from the moment his fingers had touched her sleeve to the moment his back hit the ground, had taken less than 2 seconds. To the 50 or so soldiers and Marines who now stared, mouths agape, it had been a blur of motion too fast to properly see, a magic trick ending with their giant of a gunnery sergeant lying helpless on the ground. An ocean of silence washed over the scene. The ever-present hum of the generators seemed to fade away. The young Marines stood frozen, their smirks wiped from their faces and replaced with masks of slack-jawed disbelief. Corporal Henderson looked as if he had seen a ghost. They had witnessed the impossible. They had seen a mountain toppled by a pebble. Their understanding of power, of strength, of the very physics that governed their world had been irrevocably shattered. The woman showed no signs of triumph or exertion. Her breathing was even, her posture relaxed. She stood over him, not in a posture of victory, but simply as an observer. She looked down, her expression unreadable behind her dark glasses. She nudged his combat boot gently with the toe of her own scuffed shoe. "Check his paws for glass," she said, her voice the same flat, technical monotone as before. It was an old, reflexive phrase from a different life, an instruction for checking a downed animal, clinical and detached. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned, stepped through the now open pedestrian gate, and disappeared into the labyrinth of the base. She did not look back. The silence held for a long moment after she was gone, a vacuum of pure astonishment. Then, the spell was broken by the squeal of tires. A black up-armored SUV, the kind reserved for high-ranking command staff, pulled to a screeching halt near the gate. The rear door flew open, and out stepped a man whose presence immediately eclipsed the memory of Thorne's bluster. He was a colonel, his rank denoted by the silver eagles on his collar, but it was the quiet, unshakable authority in his bearing that commanded attention. He had the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent a lifetime in harsh places, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over the scene and understood it in an instant. He saw Thorne struggling to sit up, cradling his wrist, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. He saw the stunned faces of the young Marines. His gaze followed the path the woman had taken through the gate. Colonel Jennings strode over to the fallen gunnery sergeant. He did not offer a hand. He did not ask what had happened. He looked down at Thorne with an expression of profound disappointment, a cold anger that was 1,000 times more terrifying than Thorne's hot-headed rage. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," the colonel's voice was low, precise, and carried the chilling weight of final judgment. "Get on your feet." Thorne scrambled to his feet, his face pale, his entire body radiating shame. He tried to snap to attention, but the searing pain in his wrist made him wince and falter. He stood before the colonel, a broken monument to his own arrogance. The colonel ignored him for a moment, turning his attention to the shell-shocked Marines. "You men saw what happened here?" he asked. A few of them managed a numb nod. "Let this be the most important lesson you ever learn in this corps," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. "You judge a person by their actions, not by their appearance. You measure strength not in volume, but in effect. You have just witnessed a masterclass in what happens when a loud, undisciplined ego meets quiet, absolute competence. You will remember this day for the rest of your careers." He turned his icy gaze back to Thorne. "You," he said, the single word dripping with contempt, "you put your hands on a Chief Warrant Officer 5 of the United States Army. You presume to challenge a woman who has forgotten more about combat than you will ever know. You, a gate guard with a big voice and a fragile ego, decided to physically assault one of the single most valuable and dangerous assets in this entire theater of operations." A collective, silent gasp seemed to pass through the assembled Marines. Chief Warrant Officer 5. The rank was legendary, almost mythical. They were the silent masters, the technical wizards, the quiet professionals who operated in the shadows, their expertise so profound it bordered on supernatural. They were ghosts in the machine. Colonel Jennings was not finished. He stepped closer to Thorne, his voice dropping even lower, forcing the gunnery sergeant and everyone else to lean in, to hang on every syllable. "Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" he whispered, the question a blade twisting in the wound of Thorne's humiliation. "That was Alara Vance. Does that name mean anything to you?" "No, of course it doesn't. Her name isn't meant for people like you. But perhaps you've heard the stories the old-timers tell around the fires. Perhaps you've heard the whispers in the intelligence briefings about an operative so effective, so silent, they called her Wraith. The name hung in the air, electric and terrifying. Wraith. A battlefield legend. A ghost story told to frighten new recruits. The operator who had dismantled an entire insurgent network in the Kunar Valley with nothing but a knife and a radio. The analyst who had broken an encryption standard that had baffled the entire NSA for a decade. The soldier who had walked out of the Zangali Mountains after being presumed dead for 3 weeks, carrying 2 wounded rangers and the intel that had saved an entire battalion. The stories were endless, contradictory, and unbelievable. And she was here. She was the small, quiet woman in the gray hoodie. "Her file," the colonel continued, his voice now a reverential litany, "is a litany of black ink and redactions. She has awards that are not authorized to be worn on any uniform. She has advised generals, briefed presidents, and personally trained every Tier 1 operator you've ever hero worshipped. The reason the biometric scanner on this gate works at all is because she designed the source code for the entire system when she was 19 years old. She was here today because, unlike you, Gunnery Sergeant, she does her job. She saw an anomaly in the network logs and she came down here to fix it herself, quietly and without fanfare. Because that is what professionals do. The colonel paused, letting the full crushing weight of Thorne's failure settle upon him. The fortress of Thorne's ego had not just been cracked, it had been leveled, its foundations turned to dust. The man who had built his identity on a pillar of perceived strength was now revealed as a fool, a bully, and an incompetent. He stood there, stripped bare in front of the very men he had sought to impress, his authority a pathetic illusion. Then, Colonel Jennings did something that sealed the moment in the annals of base legend. He turned his back on the humiliated gunnery sergeant. He faced the now empty pedestrian gate through which he had disappeared. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up in the sharpest, most impeccably correct salute Thorne had ever seen. It was a gesture of profound, absolute respect, a formal acknowledgement from a full-bird colonel to a living legend. He held the salute for a full 5 seconds, aimed at a person who was no longer there, a tribute to the unseen, uncelebrated competence that held their entire world together. When he dropped the salute, he turned back to Thorne. The cold anger was gone, replaced by a weary finality. "Your command has been notified, Gunnery Sergeant," he said, his voice now flat and administrative. "You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Report to the base Sergeant Major. He will have your transfer orders. You're being reassigned to a supply depot in Greenland. I suggest you spend the long, cold nights there, reflecting on the difference between shouting about strength and actually possessing it." With that, Colonel Jennings turned, climbed back into his SUV, and was gone, leaving behind a crater where a man's career used to be. Thorne stood alone in the center of the circle of his former acolytes. He was no longer their king, no longer their teacher. He was a cautionary tale. He didn't look at them. He couldn't. He stared at his throbbing wrist, at the ground, at the ghost of his own shattered pride. The young Marines, the chorus, looked at him not with pity, but with a new dawning understanding. They looked at each other. They looked at the gate. Their entire perception of the world had been recalibrated. They had learned the colonel's lesson. True strength was not loud. True authority did not need to announce itself. It was quiet. It was precise. And if you were foolish enough to grab it by the arm, it would simply, efficiently, and dispassionately put you on the ground. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at the main gate spread like wildfire through the base. It became a piece of institutional folklore, a parable whispered in chow halls and barracks. The details became exaggerated, as they always do. In some tellings, she threw Thorne over the wall. In others, she broke both his arms with a single touch. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained intact. The loud, arrogant bully had been humbled by the quiet, unassuming master. It became a teaching tool, a shorthand for the concept of the gray man, or the quiet professional. Junior NCOs would use it to check the egos of their more boisterous charges. "Don't be a thorn," they'd say, and the message was understood. Months later, and thousands of miles away, a changed Marcus Thorne stood in a cavernous, freezing warehouse in Thule, Greenland. The perpetual twilight of the Arctic winter was a fitting backdrop for the twilight of his career. He was no longer a king. He was a clerk, overseeing the inventory of parkas and snowshoes. The bluster was gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted humility. The booming voice had softened to a murmur. He had been broken, but in that breaking, a space had been created for something new to grow. He was now teaching the young airmen under his charge, but his lessons were different. He spoke not of aggression, but of awareness, not of dominance, but of discipline. He taught them to observe, to listen, to never assume, and above all, to respect the quiet ones, for you never knew what mountains of experience and skill lay hidden beneath a calm surface. He was, in his own way, honoring the legacy of the woman who had destroyed him. And Alara Vance. She was on another continent, in another dusty, dangerous place. She had likely forgotten Gunnery Sergeant Thorne's name within minutes of the encounter. The event was a minor, irritating data point in a life filled with monumental tasks, a brief spike in her operational timeline that was quickly resolved and discarded. She was now sitting in a cramped, windowless room, staring at a screen filled with cascading lines of code. A young signals intelligence lieutenant, nervous and sweating, stood beside her, trying to explain why a critical satellite uplink had failed. Alara listened patiently, her face calm, her focus absolute. After he was done stammering, she pointed a single steady finger at one line of code among millions. "The error is here," she said in her quiet, flat voice. "You have a syntax conflict in the decryption key's parity check. It's a simple fix." The lieutenant stared, dumbfounded at the line she indicated. He and his entire team had been searching for that error for 3 days. She had found it in 3 minutes. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of encouragement, before turning back to her work, another ghost in another machine, quietly holding the world together. There is a fundamental truth about the nature of strength that our world, with its endless noise and spectacle, often conspires to make us forget. We are taught to equate strength with volume, power with visibility. The loudest voice in the room is presumed to be the most important. The most ostentatious display of force is mistaken for true capability. We build our hierarchies on these flawed assumptions, creating brittle structures of ego that are destined to crumble when confronted with genuine substance. The story of the gate is not merely a story about a soldier. It is a parable about the profound and often underestimated power of quiet competence. True strength does not need to announce itself. It has no requirement for an audience. It is not performative. It simply is. It is the deep, still water that runs beneath the noisy, shallow rapids. It is the master artisan in a quiet workshop whose skill is expressed not in boasts, but in the flawless perfection of their work. It is the scholar in the dusty archives whose knowledge can change the course of history, but who speaks only in careful, measured footnotes. It is the doctor in the operating theater whose steady hands and calm focus hold the line between life and death, oblivious to the drama in the waiting room. These are the pillars that truly support the world, and they are often invisible to those who are blinded by the glare of their own self-importance. Arrogance, conversely, is a hollow vessel. It is an edifice built on the shaky foundation of external validation. The arrogant man, like Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, is a prisoner of his own performance. He requires the fear, admiration, and attention of others to feel real. His strength is a reflection in their eyes, and when they look away, it vanishes. This makes him fragile. His constant need for affirmation makes him predictable. His inability to see worth in anything that does not loudly proclaim itself makes him blind. He sees a quiet woman in a hoodie, and his mind, limited by its crude binary of predator and prey, can only register prey. He cannot conceive of a strength so profound that it has no need for display, a competence so absolute that it finds boasting to be a waste of energy. The confrontation at the gate was not a battle of bodies, but a collision of philosophies. It was the clash between the brittle, hollow noise of ego and the dense, unyielding silence of mastery. The outcome was preordained from the moment Thorne chose his target. He was not defeated by a clever technique or a surprising move. He was defeated by reality itself. He had wagered his entire identity on a flawed premise, that his physical presence and loud voice made him powerful. And the universe, in the form of a quiet woman with slate-gray eyes, simply called his bluff. The 15 seconds it took for him to end up on the ground were merely the time required for a false idea to be violently corrected by an unalterable truth. This is a lesson that extends far beyond the confines of a military base. It plays out in boardrooms, in classrooms, in families, and in the quiet chambers of our own hearts. We all encounter the loud and the arrogant, those who seek to dominate the space around them with the sheer volume of their personalities. And we all know the quiet professionals, the unassuming souls who, without fanfare or credit, make things work. They are the bedrock. They are the foundation. They are the ones who fix the code, who find the cure, who write the truth, who hold the line. Their reward is not applause or recognition, but the deep internal satisfaction of a job well done, of order restored from chaos. The ultimate gesture of the story is the colonel's salute to an empty doorway. It is an act of reverence for the unseen, a tribute to the humble nature of true excellence. It teaches us that the highest respect is reserved not for those who demand it, but for those who have earned it so completely that they no longer need it. It is a reminder to look past the surface, to listen to the silence, and to never, ever underestimate the person who is quietly and methodically cleaning their glasses. For they may be the very person who designed the world you are standing in, and they have the power to turn it off. True respect is not given to the loudest person in the room. It is earned by the most competent, and that competence often speaks in a whisper.